Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're counting down my top 20 favorite albums of 2017. Now this list is just going to be entirely my own personal opinion when it comes to the picks I have here on this list. They're just my own favorite albums released in 2017. I'm not saying that they're necessarily the best, objectively speaking, albums that were released in 2017 or anything of that sort. It's just my personal taste and also based on what I heard in 2017. Of course, I would have had to have heard the album to include it here on this list. Just because your favorite album isn't here doesn't necessarily mean that I don't like it. It could also just mean that I simply did not hear it, which is very likely considering there were many albums I didn't get a chance to checking out in 2017 that I heard good things about. But of course, I was busy, I guess you could say, listening to what I, reviewed this year. And that's another thing. If you want to see my thoughts on any of these albums on this list in further detail, I have reviewed all of them on my channel before, either in full album reviews or in one of my half-year catch-up series where I talk about albums I missed giving a full review to in shorter detail. I have reviewed all these things here in some degree on my channel, though. So if you want to see my thoughts in further detail than what I'm going to go into here in this video, make sure you check that out. And also another thing before we get started here with this list, the albums included here had to have been released in 2017. So, from January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2017. Which means Run the Jewels 3 is not going to be on this list because it was on my list last year. I'm just bringing this up because I know lots of people did include it on this year's list because they put out their year-end list before that album was released at the end of 2016. But I'm just specifying right now that it's not on this list because I included it in last year's list. In fact, you can go watch last year's list and it will be very much on that list. I do enjoy that album, and it would be here if I was including it, as part of this list. But I'm not because I included it last year. With all those disclaimers out of the way now, I think it's time to get started with my number 20 pick. And at number 20, we have Eternity in Your Arms by Creeper. This is kind of the debut album from this new sort of pop-punk, horror-punk band. And I have to say, I really like what this band is doing, especially here on this album. I know they had a couple EPs released before this thing, but I really found myself enjoying and coming back to this project throughout this year. I like how they managed to take a pop-punk sound, which I know I've mentioned it a ton in my videos, especially when talking about this group, but I just feel like most of the modern pop-punk isn't all too interesting in my own opinion. But Creeper kind of, don't fall into that category because they managed to put out really interesting pop-punk music, mostly because they managed to pull from those horror-punk elements, like I said before, in their music, and also the fact that at times they'll trade off lead vocals between their normal lead vocalist and whatever other band member does the female vocals. I don't know their names specifically, and I apologize for that, but if you've heard their music, you know what I'm speaking about, because I really love it when bands are able to have multiple vocalists kind of trading off, especially when they have different sounds to their voices. And, that's just one element that makes this album as great as it is. You have lots of fun, more upbeat pop-punk kind of jams. You have more depressing, introspective songs like Misery, for example. And you have songs with just killer hooks like Black Rain, which is just an instant, pop-punk kind of classic from this year, I feel, in my opinion. Definitely a great album. If you're a fan of pop-punk music, it needs to be on your radar. You need to check this out because I have a feeling that Creeper is going to be doing big things in the upcoming years. Next up on my list, we have an album that many of you probably had not heard of. It's Learned Helplessness from Fully Involved. Fully Involved being a one-man music project who's, the one member being Mark of the Mad Sounds podcast here on YouTube. Formerly Spin It Reviews here on YouTube, and that's originally where I discovered Mark and his content. Now this is being the first full-length album from him. I was very excited to see what it would hold, and it's sort of a kind of more personal, small-scale kind of pop-punk, pop-rock sort of sound to it that I really enjoy. I really like the fact that it's not a super overproduced sounding project, and when it comes to modern pop-punk, I know I was just speaking about it with the last album on this list as well, but I'm not a really big fan of how it seems so overproduced nowadays, just in terms of the production. And this album goes in a very opposite direction with a lot more rough around the edges type production to it, and that kind of goes nicely at the same time with the smaller scale kind of personal feel that this project has going for it. And I'm personally a fan of more personal kind of small, I guess, indie type projects. That's going to be a recurring thing on this list, which is why I'm bringing it up now. But yeah, there was a lot for me to enjoy here on this project, from catchy hooks and memorable guitar lines. It was just a really fun project overall, in my opinion, and I'm excited to see if we're going to be getting more content from Fully Involved in the future. Because if there is, I'll definitely be checking it out, and you should too, especially given that this is a smaller artist here on this list. Definitely give it a listen. Next up on my list, we have Damn by Kendrick Lamar. Probably my least favorite Kendrick Lamar album to date, though the fact that it's still in my top 20 albums of the year list should speak for the quality, not just of this album, but Kendrick's, discography when it comes to his albums. So, this is right here, while it's arguably Kendrick at his most poppy, I guess you can say, in terms of the structures of some of these tracks, the more, trap-influenced instrumentals that appear on this project, he manages to excel at these, and it just kind of proves that Kendrick is able to move into this more pop, I guess, hip-hop sound that so many other artists do, but he manages to do it so much better. It really proves his versatility as an artist, which is definitely one of the cooler things to see here. You have tracks that go really hard on this thing, like DNA and Humble, the popular lead single from this thing. You have more introspective tracks like Fear and Duckworth, which comes at the end of this thing. It's a very enjoyable collection of tracks, and I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm not a big fan of the whole listen to it backwards thing for another meeting that kind of goes with the collector's edition of the thing that was released. But even with all that aside and the memes aside, all that, it's still a very great album on its own. It manages to see Kendrick stepping into new territory with his music yet again, once again proving that he is one of the most versatile and competent artists in this modern era of music. Next up on my list, we have Written at Night by Uncommon NASA. Now, I only discovered Uncommon NASA this year, but I have to say, this album, which was really my gateway into his music, stuck with me since first hearing it, and that's because this album manages to pull off a lot of interesting things that I find myself personally enjoying. For one thing, I really like the concept of this record, the whole Written at Night, and how the album kind of progresses throughout the night as it goes on. I feel like that's a very interesting concept that's going through it. I like how they're able to tackle more political messages here on this album without sounding super obvious or super, just delivering messages that so many artists are delivering at the most basic level. If there's one thing in 2017 that I feel like was a bad thing, it was that there were so many artists, especially when it comes to politics, delivering just very basic messages without really giving much, greater detail into it. But I feel like Uncommon NASA and the large amount of guest features he has on this project are able to do that here, which is something that is not exclusive to this project by any means. We're going to be talking about more of that later on, but I feel like this is one of the best cases of it being done really well. And to go back to the guest features on this thing, like I said, there's a lot of them here. And typically I'm not a fan of projects with tons of guest features, because lots of times I feel like it takes away from the main featured artist and things of that sort. But here, the guest features really only add to the project. They don't feel out of place. They feel like they're all working towards one greater goal in this album, which is something that I don't always feel guest features do, especially when there's a lot of them. But for some reason, this album, despite the fact that it's a lot of guest features, still manages to be very consistent and work towards one nice message. It goes nicely with the album concept, and I have to say, this is easily one of my favorite hip-hop albums of 2017. Next up on my list, we have Forever by Code Orange, a metalcore album that, while metalcore is a genre that, while I like it, at least the very, basic metalcore, metallic hardcore, not so much a lot of the, subgenres that have kind of sprung off of it, but at the very basic level, I enjoy metalcore, though it's not a genre I've, dived into a ton of. But I really enjoy this album, particularly for the experimentation that's done on this thing. You'll have tracks like the title track, which is just a more straightforward, aggressive metalcore song, but you'll also have tracks that experiment with industrial sounds. You'll have tracks that experiment more with alternative rock or alternative metal, pop punk, all these different kind of sounds. But at the same time, it never strays too far from the normal metalcore sound of this thing to really feel disjointed or anything like that. It feels consistent all the way through. I like how they take advantage of different singers in the band. Once again, I love it when bands are able to do that. And, some of the tracks here are just really aggressive and angry. You'll have tracks like Bleeding in the Blur, which is more of an alternative rock type song with a very kind of hazy atmosphere to it that I enjoy. It's just a very diverse yet enjoyable metalcore project, and for that reason I found myself returning to this a ton throughout the year. Next up, we have Conformicide by Havoc, the 4th studio album from these thrash metal guys, I guess, whatever you want to call them. I really like this thing, and when it comes to most modern thrash metal music, lots of times I feel like it can be very generic, very, run-of-the-mill, but this album manages to stand out with some very solid instrumentation going throughout this thing. I love the fact that the bass guitar is so prominent throughout this album. It's easily one of the most standout qualities about this thing. I love the aggression in this thing, and of course thrash metal as a whole I would say is an aggressive genre. But here on this album in particular, it just feels particularly aggressive. And while the political lyrics on this thing aren't anything new for thrash metal as a whole, they still manage to be very, relevant, I guess you could say. They're not really providing anything super new or insightful to anything political at the moment. But for what it is, it's very enjoyable. It doesn't really get in the way of the music. It's very fun. There's lots of great solos on this thing and riffs. The bass guitar, like I said, is phenomenal. The vocals manage to carry that anger and that just disgust for everything that's kind of going on right now in the world. It's a great thrash metal album, one of my favorite thrash albums of the year. Next up, we have Cat Heaven by Roy Blair. This is another more personal, small-scale type of album, and like I said earlier, I really enjoy types of projects like this, and this one here is no exception. This album pulls from a lot of different sounds, whether it be, primarily things like alternative R&B and alternative pop, but also bits of hip-hop and alternative rock as well, and it manages to create a very, uniform mixture of these sounds throughout the project, so it doesn't feel disjointed or like it's just reaching for too many genres or anything like that. It's very consistent in its sound. I love the storytelling on this album as well. The lyrics are very enjoyable. Lots of great hooks on this thing. The instrumentals pair nicely with Roy's voice. Overall, I'd have to say it's just an album that, it's a very small-scale type of personal album. When you listen to a project like this, you kind of get the feel like you know the artist a bit better with the stories that they tell. And that's really kind of what I got out of this album going away from it. And that's something that I really much enjoy. And it's more, I guess you could say, relaxing sounding album that you could just listen to and have a fun time to. But there's a lot of lyrical depth to it as well that I enjoy. So yeah, if you haven't checked this one out, I know it's also from a smaller scale artist, I could say, definitely give this one a listen because, like I said, it is one of my favorite projects of the year. Next up on my list, we have Heartless by Pallbearer. This sort of doom metal band is another one that I happened to stumble across this year, and I really enjoy this album. I like the more emotional kind of doom metal sound that they have going for them, and I think it works very nicely with the lyrics that are spread across this project. How it's not just, kind of typical metal cliches or anything like that. There's a bit more of a, emotional punch to it that works very nicely, and it gives me something to kind of come back to. A lot of the songs on here, while they are kind of longer in length, they don't really, seem to drag on or just, be filler to make this thing seem to last longer than it actually is. Every minute of this thing is spent, doing something interesting, from great riffs that just kind of have a very heavy, doomy sound to them that pairs nicely with the more sorrowful vocals of this thing. It's a very memorable project, and it's one that I found myself returning to frequently throughout the year because of that. And it's one that, if you haven't checked it out yet, you need to do so. Next up, we have Joey Badass with his newest album, All American Badass. And this album, one thing I really like about it is how he's able to take political lyrics here, especially in a year where, like I said before, so many political lyrics felt really run-of-the-mill and boring. Here he's able to provide some very unique and interesting perspectives here into his music. Here on this album, you get to experience a wide array of emotions, from anger to sorrow to hope. It covers a lot of different ground with it, but still kind of all, ties back to similar political and just social themed lyrics that were very enjoyable to listen to. I like a lot of his singing on this project as well as his rapping, which isn't exactly something I necessarily anticipated a lot of on this thing. He provides some great hooks here on tracks like Devastated and Temptation. His rapping here, once again, is great as well. The features on this thing are very enjoyable. It's overall just a really solid hip-hop album that we got this year, and it's definitely one that you need to check out. Next up on my list, we have Gods of Violence by Creator. And now Creator here are once again just continuing with another solid addition to their discography. It seems like when it comes to Creator, they can't put out a bad album, especially in recent years. They just keep putting out quality album after quality album, and while continuing the more melodic thrash metal sound that they've kind of found for themselves. And Gods of Violence is no exception to that. And while I don't like it as much as their last album, Phantom Antichrist, that was a hard album to top in my opinion. Probably my favorite Creator album. And this one here, it still is a great album in my opinion. Lots of memorable solos and guitar parts, along with lyrics and just vocal deliveries. It manages to have that melodic thrash metal Creator sound to it. That just it's very solid, I guess is the word I'm looking for. While it doesn't exactly bring much new to the table in terms of adding to this sound that Creator have made for themselves, it manages to be very it still manages to be very solid, very memorable, very well put together, very well performed, and for that reason I still found myself returning to this thing a ton throughout the year. So yeah, check it out. Next up on my list, we have another album that's following up probably one of my favorite albums from the band in question here. It's Villains by Queens of the Stone Age. And once again, while I don't necessarily like this album as much as I liked Like Clockwork, which is probably my favorite Queens of the Stone Age album, I still feel that Villains is a very solid addition to their discography. Of course, given that it is number 10 here on my favorite albums of the year list. I just really like how they managed to, once again, move their sound forward, add some new things into the mix, while still delivering a very solid project with this thing. I like how they added some synths into this, something that they didn't really do much of on previous records before, with a couple exceptions, of course. I like how there's some more upbeat sounding moments on this thing, like The Way You Used to Do, or just the really catchy Feet Don't Fail Me Now, that opens up this thing. There's more introspective moments on this thing as well, with very catchy hooks to them. I just love the feel that some of these tracks bring with them. And even though this album I believe only has about 9 tracks on it, it's very clear that they were going for quality over quantity with this album. Just proving that this band, despite being as old as they are still putting out great content. And it's definitely an album that you shouldn't miss out on, that was released in 2017. Next up, folks, we have Forever is a Mighty Long Time by Big Crit, another artist I only really stumbled upon this year, and this being my first exposure to Big Crit. I feel like there wasn't a better project to really kind of stumble across him with, because this album really gives you everything you could ask for from Big Crit. Being a double album, especially being a double album, considering those are hard to make with such good quality. This album, or albums rather, manages to pull off what it's trying to do very well in my opinion. The first disc of this thing are just a bunch of tracks that go really hard for about a normal album's length. You have great tracks on there, just track after track. It's very apparent when you're listening to this thing for the first time that you might expect it to drop in quality at one point, considering it's a double album. Maybe have some more filler leaning tracks in there, but no, the hard hitting tracks just come one after another on this thing. And it's fantastic. And then you have the second disc, which is more introspective tracks. And I really like how Big Crit kind of separates what he wanted to do with this album or this project into 2 separate discs. Typically when artists put out double albums or multiple albums in a year or something like that, I feel like it's done just, to put out more content, to make more money off it, to have more people streaming it or something like that. There's not really much of a greater purpose to it sometimes. But here, I feel like there definitely was a greater purpose to it. Once again, the separation of the sounds of the 2 discs makes for, one disc which just has a lot of fun tracks that go really hard, and then another disc of tracks that is very, introspective, very personal. And when listening to this thing, it makes it so that you can kind of separate Big Crit's music into these 2 categories when listening to this album, and you're able to enjoy it just a bit more, just because I feel like this greater, longer length project is organized in this fashion. It doesn't really feel like it's just, an hour and like a half of music just slapped together, as a double album so that, Big Crit gets more streams on it or something like that. I feel like there's a reason for this album being as long as it is, and it manages to be, one of my favorite projects of the year. Like you could probably figure because it's on this list. Despite this project's longer length, and I am a fan of shorter albums typically. Despite this thing's longer length, I found myself coming back to it and re-listening to it, repeatedly over and over again, just because it is such an enjoyable listen given the two different sounds that you're really given here on this project. So yeah, Forever is a Mighty Long Time is a great album, one of my favorite hip hop albums of the year, and a great double album as well, which are very difficult to come by just in general for music. So I have to say the fact that Big Crit managed to make a project that's up there with some of the greats when it comes to double albums. He's definitely done something special with this project. So make sure you do not check not check this out. Check it out is what I'm trying to say. Check it out at all cost. Next up on my list, we have Melodrama by Lorde. Another project that I really didn't anticipate until hearing the lead single from this thing earlier this year, Greenlight, which is a track I enjoyed. Now, when it came to Lorde's first studio album, while I enjoy it, it's definitely, not anywhere near as good as this project, in my opinion. I feel like that first album was more of a smaller scale kind of first project, more minimalistic beats and things of that sort. But here on this thing, I love the grander approach that it takes to things. This album is a kind of a concept record, kind of following a breakup of sorts. And while breakup concept albums aren't anything new by any stretch of the imagination, this album managed to be one of the best examples of that archetype, in my opinion, just because it is very well executed. You have tracks like Greenlight, which, despite the fact that they're not happy songs, have a bit more energy to them. On the other hand, you have songs like Liability, which are, just plain flat out depressing. And it just, the fact that this album manages to cover a lot of different feelings and emotions and aspects of the whole breakup concept, aside from just, whining tracks that, why don't you love me or something like that. Like so many albums or songs that kind of go for this concept seem to just do, and don't really expand on the concept all that much. This album manages to expand on it over some great production, great performances from Lorde herself. It's just a very memorable album, in my opinion, one I found myself returning to frequently, and it just manages to be one of the more emotionally impactful albums of the year as well. So yeah, check this one out. Next up on the list, we have After Laughter from Paramore. And while I have been a fan of Paramore in the past, they haven't really, wowed me until this album, which really surprised me because I didn't really expect a ton from this thing going into it. But man, this thing really stuck with me. I love the fact how you have the lyrics on this thing, which are just really, depressing, dealing with things like anxiety and depression and things of that sort. But they're all kind of put up against these very happy, upbeat sounding instrumentals. Of course, just listen to the lead single from this thing, Hard Times, to know what I'm speaking of, because it's not just that one song. The entire album kind of follows with that, which makes for a very interesting listen, because while you have these very depressing lyrics running throughout this project, believe me, they don't lighten up at all at any point here on this thing. You also have these very happy instrumentals and very catchy hooks. It's the kind of album that you may want to listen to when you're feeling happy, or in the middle of the summer or something like that, just because it does have that very uplifting sort of feel to it if you ignore the lyrics. But then again, at the same time, when you start looking at those lyrics, you realize there's a lot more to this as well, and it also becomes kind of depressing. And the fact that you're enjoying it so much kind of starts to bother you, but not like in a very interesting way, where it gets you to think about this thing even more than you might have already been thinking about it. I like how Paramore went for a more kind of 80s leaning sort of synth pop kind of sound on this thing as well. Most of their older music being more like pop rock, pop punk kind of stuff. This one, of course, while it does keep the poppy elements to it, in fact, it might be one of their poppiest albums yet, I feel like it definitely This new sound works very nicely, especially with this whole concept I was talking about before of having those very, depressing lyrics against these very happy instrumentals. It just ties together so nicely, in my opinion, and it makes for one of the most memorable and, replayable albums of the year, in my own opinion. I found myself returning to this thing countless times throughout the year. Once again, like I mentioned before, particularly during the summers, because it has a very, upbeat sort of feel to it, even though the lyrics themselves are very depressing. But yeah, check this one out. Next up, we have Flower Boy by Tyler, the Creator. Kind of like with Paramore, I've been a fan of Tyler in the past, but never really a major fan or anything. He hadn't really wowed me with any of his projects before. But this project, on the other hand, just completely blew me away like the Paramore album did as well. And this thing also continued to grow on me a lot throughout the year. I know I was very positive towards it when I initially reviewed it back when it was first released, but believe me, it grew on me even more just in the second half of this year as I continued to listen to it and just get repeatedly drawn back into this album's world that it kind of created. I like how Tyler went for a more introspective feel on this project compared to some of his older albums. I like getting to see the more, personal side of Tyler, kind of him talking about his boredom, his sadness, loneliness, things like that, just throughout this project. It's definitely more of a sad-sounding album overall, but, I kind of like those projects at times. It's not to say that it's completely like that, because there are some really hard-hitting tracks on here as well, like Ain't Got Time and Who Dat Boy, which are just really hard-hitting, still come back to those regularly, but the more sad-leaning tracks on here are really what stand out at times as well. I really love the production on this thing that Tyler provided as well. It just works so nicely with the album itself. The features on this thing are also fantastic. Even though I was a bit skeptical about some of them going into this thing, they still managed to wow me. Just working so well in pair with Tyler and the production that he's provided here, and the concept of the record as a whole. It's just a project that I've seen grown on me a ton. I revisit this thing frequently, even to this day, and I can only see myself revisiting it even more in the future. So for that reason, it's easily one of my favorite albums of 2017. Next up on the list, we have Emperor of Sand by Mastodon. While I'm a pretty big Mastodon fan, I reviewed all their albums leading up to the release of this one. This album has stuck with me a ton throughout the year. I've just revisited this thing to re-listen to it frequently, not just because, I had to or anything like that, just out of, pure enjoyment of the project. I really love the lyrics on this thing and how they kind of, deal with telling the story that's meant to mirror that of a cancer patient. Now, while cancer is something I've had to, not personally deal with in my own life, more so with people that I know in my life, it is still something that has affected me. And I do know that many people out there are in similar scenarios. Either they've had to deal with cancer themselves or know someone who has had to deal with cancer themselves. And for that reason, I feel like this album definitely has a lot of relatability to it. And while lyrics I have felt have always been a strong point for Mastodon, especially with some of the crazier concept that they've come up with before in the past that I really enjoy. This one here, while it definitely has an interesting story to it with the Emperor of Sand and death and things like that, the fact that it kind of mirrors this really real life thing that so many people deal with, I really liked. And the fact that the band members were willing to take this thing that they were dealing with in real life. Of course, people at the band knew themselves, like family members, were dealing with cancer, which was what inspired the lyrics on this thing. I gotta commend them for that, because while they're certainly not the first band or artist to ever talk about this on record, it's just done so well that I gotta commend them for that. I just also really love the music itself on this thing. Lots of catchy hooks throughout this thing, lots of great guitar solos and riffs as well. I love the more groove-oriented tracks like Steam Breather as well. The really epic outro that is Jaguar God is fantastic in my opinion. I love the solo that comes at the end of that track and just closes off the entire album. It's fantastic. As well as tracks like Ancient Kingdom, which gets me pumped up every time I hear it. The album covers a lot of different, types of tracks, I guess you could say, but still manages to sound very consistent overall. And, the mixture of, the greatly performed music, the great concept and lyrics, all those things are things I look for in a Mastodon project, and they're all present here. So, of course, I'm going to like this thing. Check it out. Next up on the list, we have Reflections of a Floating World by Elder. This sort of progressive doom metal project is one that I hadn't really anticipated going into the year, just because while I had a previous experience with this band like a couple of years ago, it was really before I had gotten into doom metal and progressive metal, things like that. So I wasn't really able to completely appreciate the project or the group. But when I heard this thing was released, and with the more knowledge that I had now concerning metal subgenres and things like that, I decided to give the band another chance with this project. And good thing I did, because this album is fantastic. I love this thing so much. Once again, kind of like the Palbearer album I was talking about before, this definitely falls into the more emotionally driven, I guess, doom metal type sound. This album definitely has more of a progressive metal type feel, and maybe a bit of stoner metal as well, for good measure. And I just really love a lot of the aspects of this thing, like the guitar tone on this project. It just sounds so fantastic to me. And this album, when listening through it, this is definitely more of a personal thing more than anything else, but it just gives me sort of a nostalgic feeling when listening to this thing, which is definitely weird, considering that, like I said, I didn't get into this band or this album until it was just released this year. I really had no prior experience to them or anything like that that shouldn't make me feel nostalgic. But, when listening to this thing, I'm not sure if it's the guitar tone or just the delivery of the lyrics, just the wonderful sounding vocals on this thing, or is it just, the epic structuring of these tracks. Something about this album just gives me nostalgic feels. And I'm not going to complain about that because I really enjoy it. And, even with that aside, this thing is just fantastic all the way through. Easily one of the best doom metal albums I've, ever heard. Easily, it is my favorite metal album of 2017 because the next three we have on this list aren't metal albums. But yeah, this album, you need to check this thing out, guys. Definitely make sure it's on your radar. It's a fantastic album. And with that said, it's time to move into my number 3 spot, though, as opposed to continuing this list like I've been doing, with one album, revealing it and then talking about it. For the next 3 on the list, I kind of have to talk about them all at once. And, while that might seem a bit strange to you, it's going to make a lot of sense in a couple minutes once I explain it all, or it should at least. And that's because the next 3 albums on my list are, the 3 albums in Brockhampton's Saturation trilogy. More specifically, at number 3 on my list is Saturation 2, at number 2 on my list is Saturation 1, and at number 1 on my list, my album of 2017, is Saturation 3. These 3 albums, man, really blew me away this year. Brockhampton is another artist this year that I happened to stumble upon by chance, really, and I just fell in love with their music and so much about what they do. And these 3 albums have just been in constant rotation for me throughout the year. Even Saturation 3, even though it was just released about halfway through December, I've played it a ton since then, and I am still very confident in putting it here at number 1 on the list. Even though I feel like these 3 albums are the difference between quality in these 3 albums and my own personal enjoyment of these 3 albums is so small that you could practically interchange any of these 3 albums with another on this list, and I'd be perfectly fine with it overall. But yeah, I'm going to talk about these albums as they were released, as opposed to how they are here on this list in terms of my own preference, just because I feel like that makes more sense. So Saturation 1, even though it's number 2 on my list, I'm going to start talking about that one now. Saturation 1, the first Brockhampton project I heard, the first, insight to this group that I got. And back when I first heard it, it was such a project that upon first hearing it, I knew that this was something special and that I needed to keep listening to this group. And good thing I did, because this thing continued to grow on me, continued to just stand out to me. I loved how they were able to mix, more hardcore sounding hip-hop tracks like Heat and Bump with, more fun sounding hip-hop tracks like Golden Star and Boys, with sadder R&B kind of type tracks like Swim or Waste. It was such a diverse array of sounds, but put together so nicely and so logically that listening to this thing all the way through was just a pleasure every single time I did it, especially throughout the summer. This project kind of has a summer-like feel to it, and listening to it throughout the summer, particularly while I was on vacation, was just a great experience, and something that I don't feel like I'll ever be able to really replicate in the same way again. Saturation 2, while it is my least favorite out of the trilogy, at least as of right now, like I said, the difference in quality between these things is so minuscule that it doesn't really matter. But this thing is also a great album. Definitely a more hip-hop oriented album. I feel like there's less of the R&B type moments that were present on Saturation 1. But this one here, I really like a lot of the tracks here. Tracks like Gummy and Sweet and Junkie just have some of the best verses of the members on these things. The beats on this thing are also fantastic as well. And this project also kind of has a bit of a summer feel to it. It was released towards the end of the summer, and I was still playing it a ton, walking around, and when it was warm out and stuff. So this album also reminds me a fair bit of summer, though maybe not quite as much as one. It's still a very enjoyable album and one that you need to check out. And then Saturation 3, my album of the year, even though it has been out for the least amount of time out of these 3 albums, or really any of the albums on this list, I still feel really confident in putting it here at number 1, just because out of all the Saturation albums, there's really less weak moments, I guess you could say, on this one. Not that there's any really weak moments on the other ones, I feel, but this one here, I just track after track, every song here on Saturation 3 is great, and it has such a memorable quality to it. You have tracks like Boogie, which just the first time I heard this thing, I was just left in shock because of how odd it was, yet great. You have tracks like Zipper that just kind of continues with the more hip-hop oriented sound that Saturation 2 kind of had with it, but with some more great verses and things like that. I feel like Saturation 3 has some of the best verses of all the members. You kind of have, once again, that really wide array of sounds ranging from that kind of more smooth R&B sound that you could hear on tracks like Rental or the first half of Team, but you also have the more heavy hardcore stuff like Sister, or even tracks like Boogie. It once again covers a wide array of sounds, but manages to do so in such a very nice way. And this trilogy as a whole, talking about it as a whole, is also important, just given that it is a trilogy. These albums are supposed to be kind of experienced as a whole as well, and given that there is a story that's kind of going along with it, that's going to be part of the upcoming movie that Brockhampton is making, or has made. They're just finishing it up now, I believe. It's an interesting project to say the least, and especially releasing 3 great albums in a year, like that's such a rare thing to happen. Yet Brockhampton, this new upcoming group, have managed to pull it off, and for that reason they've kind of gone from being like unknown to this hot rising group as of now in early January 2018. It's just amazing to think that these guys have exploded so much just because of the quality of these 3 projects. And the explosion in popularity of these guys is definitely well-deserved. They deserve all the popularity for putting out the 3 albums of this quality in like half a year's worth of time. It's amazing, honestly. So yeah, Saturation Trilogy, my top 3 albums of the year. I can't really recommend one over another, even though I picked my own personal favorites over the others. I recommend listening to this thing as a whole, 1, 2, 3. You not necessarily like at once and one sitting or anything like that. You don't have to go that far on your first time listening to them, but definitely listen to all 3 of these albums. They're easily some of the most creative, interesting, and fun, yet at the same time kind of sad hip-hop albums that I've heard in recent times. And I expect big things from Brockhampton going forward, and I'm excited to see what they do. But yeah, that really sums up everything I have to say about that trilogy of albums. Just a great collection of music that we were fortunate enough to get in 2017. And yeah, that's my top 20 albums of 2017. Once again, guys, it's just my own personal opinion, so if you happen to disagree with anything, it's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine to have your own list, and in fact, your list will probably be different than mine, considering so much of my picks are based on experiences I've had when listening to this music, my own personal reactions to this music, and of course, the fact that I haven't listened to everything that was released in 2017. In fact, looking back on other people's best albums of the year list, I just realized how many projects I've managed to miss, and I'll have to catch up on. But hey, I got to hear these 20 great projects, and if you haven't done so already, you should hear them too, because like I said, they're all equally worth your time in my opinion, and they're all worth checking out. So make sure you do that. If you want to see any of my other year-end lists, there's a playlist linked in the description down below that will take you to a playlist on my channel that has all my year-end lists in there, as well as all the lists that I've made on my channel. You can check those out. There's worst albums, best songs, worst songs, all that type of stuff. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, guys, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on other music-related content, a list like this, album reviews, things of that sort. Comment down below your thoughts. What are some of your favorite albums of 2017? I greatly appreciate knowing, so, leave it down below. Follow me on all the social medias I have linked in the description down below as well. Thank you for watching, guys. Thanks for a great year, and stay golden.